Once upon a time, in a small village named Swindlington, there lived a young 11-year-old boy named Donald Sentry. Donald was the most popular child in his school. Everybody loved him for his sweet basketball skills and his wicked cool mohawk. Don defined himself by these two things in particular. His whole life revolved around his sweet basketball skills and wicked cool mohawk. Anything could happen to Don, but he wouldn't care, just as long as he still had his sweet basketball skills and his wicked cool mohawk. Don was 40 minutes into the championship final of his local youth club's basketball competition. Everyone had known that whatever team Don was on would have an unfair advantage, so while they were figuring out what to do, Don stood up and volunteered to play on his own, with everyone else against him. Everyone laughed, but they agreed, and so Don played by himself. To everyone's surprise, Don destroyed his competition. No one could get the ball from him, and he was slam dunking so much the referee had to make sure that the net wouldn't break. Then suddenly, as Don leapt through the air, about to score the winning point, he felt a searing pain deep in his chest. It felt as though his lungs had been filled with molten steel and his heart had been clamped in a burning vice. He fell to the ground. As everything went dark around him and he coughed painfully into his hand, trembling, he opened his hand and stared at the crimson ichor that stained his palm. His vision closed in around the bloody saliva as his head suddenly felt lighter than it ever had before. The last thing he remembered was the side of his head striking the ground with a dull, painful thud. Donald sat on the bench in the doctor's office. He could hear the voices around him clearly, but his brain refused to acknowledge them, instead focusing on the gentle roar of the street outside. A normal world, with normal people doing normal things. A world he knew he might never see again. Dysentery. The word cut through his clouded mind like an arrow through the heart. It had spread to his lungs. Death was almost certain, and if he were to have any chance of survival, he would need to be rushed to the hospital and subjected to extensive chemotherapy. His mother burst into tears as the reality of the situation finally dawned on her. Don did not cry. He couldn't. He felt nothing. No sadness, no fear, no pain. Just nothing. He turned to the doctor and looked him in the eyes for a moment. He saw a man who had witnessed this pain many times before. A man who wanted to help, but knew there was nothing he could do. Don nodded, and the doctor reached for his phone to call an ambulance. Don simply stared out the window, at the normal world he knew he'd never see again. The hospital bed was cold and hard, like industrial steel pressed against his back. Don stared blankly across the room as the doctor explained everything to his parents. As he explained how Don only had 50 days to live, and how a Make-A-Wish Foundation representative was on their way to see if there was anything they could do to make his final days more enjoyable. Don didn't care. The chemotherapy had weakened his legs and taken his hair. Anything could happen to Don, and he wouldn't care. He'd lost his sweet basketball skills and wicked cool mohawk, and there had never been anything else in this world for him. Nothing in this world. The representative entered the room. He was a kindly man with a wild smile and a black leather briefcase. He sat at the end of Don's bed and began to ask how Don was feeling. Don cut him off as he made his request. A mobile phone and the attention of Earth's greatest defender, Elon. The tweet was sent, and in less than a minute there was a response. 30 seconds before that, the parts for Donald Sentry's new spaceship had already left SpaceX's warehouse. Elon knew what Donald was going through. He had stopped the ice caps from melting by dragging them out of the ocean and personally flying them all the way to Mars. The space radiation had made him deathly ill, but once he saw the beauties of space, he knew he could never deny anyone the right to see it. So just before he climbed into his cryo chamber to await a cure for his condition, he gave the order to make a little boy smile, one last time. Less than a week and the package was there, so large they had to cordon off a whole park just for Donald to work. And work he did. Day and night he worked tirelessly, with a newfound vigour, desperate to see the stars up close just once before his end. To die up there would be to die free. Free not only from the dystopian laws of the new Spanish Empire he lived under, but free from the very bounds of his existence, free from everything he'd ever known, and everything he feasibly could know. To die facing the void would be to die confronting the pointlessness of his life, to die knowing that his life had no impact on Earth or the greater universe, knowing that his life and death would amount to nothing and be forgotten before too long, brought a strange joy to Donald, and he wanted to confirm his insignificance in the moments as he passed into the eternal nothingness that would surely come after his death. The spaceship towered over the park. Half the village was in its shade as it blocked out the sun. All the villagers had come to see the takeoff, and they whispered among themselves as Don walked the ramp up into the cockpit. The airlock was sealed. Fuel lines opened, and ignition sparked as the engines roared to life, and the ship rose to the sky and pierced the clouds, trails of flame scorching the village below. Don braced in his chair as the seatbelt tightened around his chest and the ship shook uncontrollably, soaring towards its celestial destination, edging ever closer to the heavens. And then he was there. The ship fell still and silent. Don unclasped his seatbelt and floated out of the chair. He pushed himself forwards towards the window and gazed into the endless void. He let out one last sigh as his body began to shut down. He had kept himself alive through sheer willpower, but now that he was here, he could finally let go. Then suddenly a wave of force slammed into the ship and sent Donald flying. He pushed himself back to the window as the ship lurched uncontrollably forwards. He peered out and saw a swirling mass of colours, an incomprehensible vortex where before there had been nothing. As the ship was sucked into the portal, it increased to 100 times what it had been before, and Don was tossed around the cockpit, slamming into walls and panels. It felt as though it had been over in a moment, but he had had memories of it lasting an eternity before he was cast out into some unknown place. Through the cracked window, he saw the familiar blue of the sky and the unmistakable green of the grass, but before he had time to collect his thoughts, he was flung forwards as the ship collided with the ground. He opened his eyes and saw a crowd of people had gathered around the crash site. They appeared human, but there was something off about them. They seemed simple and lesser than he was, like their brains were only partially working, and they had a gormless look about them that made Donald feel rather uncomfortable. Don pulled himself out of the wreckage and looked around. He didn't need to concern himself with these people. All he needed to do was fix his ship and return to space, which he could do very easily so long as he found the power crystal. That's when he noticed one of the strange men holding the crystal at the end of his long stick-like arm. The man was parading the crystal to his friends and performing a kind of frenzied tap dance as he did so. Donald yelled at the man and asked him to return the crystal, but he did not. Instead he just stared at Don and continued with his strange dance. Don took this to its only logical conclusion. The man was challenging him to a dance battle. Don dropped to the floor and landed on only one arm. Then he began to spin his whole body around, switching arm with every rotation, making sure to do cool kick moves and make awesome finger guns whenever he got the chance. The stranger then upped the game. He grabbed two of his friends by the hand and began spinning vertically, the power crystal floating between them, giving power to their freakish forms. Donald knew it was hopeless. He could never pull off such an advanced move, and so he stopped dancing in order to congratulate the winner. Except, he didn't. He couldn't stop. No matter how hard he tried to stop his body, he just couldn't stop spinning and doing cool kick moves. He was sure the strangers had cursed him, but as he looked around, he saw that they were all suffering the same fate. The whole village was engaged in a chaotic, maddening dance. It lasted for days. 400 people all moving their bodies to the sound of silent music, all refusing to eat or sleep. It was too much for some of them. Some had collapsed after only a few hours, and their bodies hadn't moved since. Don felt a sharp pain in his chest. His arm wobbled, and he knew he'd be the next to fall. Then a second sharp pain struck, and he fell to his knees. One hand clutched his chest while the other was raised to the clouds. He pled with whatever being was out there to give him a chance, to make it not end like this. Then the pain stopped. His aching muscles felt completely relaxed. The hard ground beneath him had become soft and comfortable. He rose to his feet and looked around. There was nothing but clouds below him and nothing but sky above. Straight ahead, at the end of what happened to be a road of clouds, he saw a huge golden gate. It shined brighter than the sun, though it did not hurt his eyes. He walked forwards and slowly pushed open the gate. There was nothing beyond it except more clouds and an old man with a long beard, wearing a white robe and red shawl. As Donald approached, the man explained that he was God, and that he was here to escort Don into heaven. Don's mind was racing. He was religious, but he never expected to actually meet God himself. There were so many questions he should be asking, but there was only one he wanted to. Don had had a dog named Scrappers since the day he was born. They had been inseparable, and Scrappers had been his best friend until he had passed away a few years ago. Donald's mother had comforted him by saying that all dogs go to heaven. So Don asked God how true this was. He asked if he could see Scrappers again. God said no. He explained that it didn't matter how much of a good boy they were, or how pure their soul was. Dogs simply were not intelligent enough to believe in God. It doesn't matter who you are as a person. You could commit terrible sins, but so long as you believed in God, you would go to heaven. Don was shocked. He wanted to inquire more, but before he could, a hand shot through the clouds. A man pulled himself from the ground. He had a black suit and shaggy black hair. Before anyone could react, he plunged a knife deep into God's heart. God looked shocked, but before anyone could even try to save him, he vanished into nothingness. John Wick stood there, blood dripping from his knife through the hole in the clouds. He had finally avenged every dog. John looked at the young boy before him, who managed to stutter out some words about how he had just killed God. "No, I didn't," John said. "I could not kill God, because there is no God." The boy was confused. He had just seen God, and he had just seen this man kill him. Don looked around him at the heavenly vastness before him, and only one thing arose to his mind. "It's breathtaking." Before he could say anything else, John walked over to the boy and put a hand on his shoulder before saying, "No, Don, you're breathtaking. But you're also dead, Don." And then, there was nothing. No one would know the story of how Don went to space, started the dancing plague of 1518, or watched John Wick kill God. Because none of it ever happened. The doctors walked in the next morning and found Don Sentry lying in his deathbed. The dysentery had been too much for him to cope with, and he had died during the night. His whole adventure had been a drug-induced hallucination, a chemo dream. The world went on without Donald Sentry, and eventually, he was forgotten.